Welcome to everyone just joining us. Okay, I'm going to be respectful of your time, so let's get started. So welcome to our webinar, Smarter Simulations, Leveraging AI in Healthcare Simulation. This is a version of a presentation that I did this year at SimGhost in Nashville, and we wanted to be able to share it with a larger audience. So let's get going. So who am I? I'm Dunbar. I am the clinical product manager here at OMS. I've been a nurse for about 100 years, and I've been an educator, nursing professor, as well as director of clinical simulation for over 20 years. And I've been with OMS for just about 3 years, fresh back from the NLN conference. So anyone who is there, glad to see you. As I've mentioned before, if you would pop into the chat and just let us know who you are and where you're from and what your role is, that would be great. So let's talk about the objectives for today's session. So this isn't a high level, what is AI talk? It's grounded in practical use cases, what's real versus hype, and what questions you should ask as the gatekeeper of quality use of AI in your organizations. We're going to cover both technical and practical aspects, what AI can actually do, how it fits into current workflows, and where you would be cautious. Whether you're running sims or you're building them or you're supporting educators, there's something in this presentation for you. So as I said, I originally did this presentation in Nashville, and I always like to bring some local flavor when I'm doing a presentation. But I thought this quote by Dolly Parton was very apropos for AI. We cannot direct the wind, but we can adjust our sails. And as you can see, I have many of Dolly's accolades there. And who doesn't believe Dolly Parton? So when we're looking at what AI really does in VR simulation, and not just VR simulation, but in all simulation, AI can make sims feel very alive. It allows patients to talk. It decisions triggers for new paths, depending on what the learner does. And data is collected as learners go along through the simulations. The key is it needs to be designed well and implemented thoughtfully, emphasizing a shift from static sims, where they're not very dynamic and pre-programmed, to very responsive environments, patients, and other characters in the simulation. Think of AI as an engine for realism and efficiency. It lets the learners talk to the sim, makes the characters feel much more alive, very similar to standardized patients, and adapts in real time. And while all of that is happening, it's collecting data without extra effort on your part. So how does AI change the workflow? Well, when we're looking at the workflow, before AI, we manually wrote our scripts. We had very fixed branching for our scenarios. So the scenario, the learner would do one thing, and then we would expect the simulator or the simulations to recognize that and do one set of things. It was very time consuming when we had to do edits and going back and testing those simulations after the edits. With AI, we have dynamic conversations. So the AI is constantly keeping track of what the learner is saying and moving into different areas to make it feel more natural. We have fewer hard-coded paths. So in other words, depending on what the learner does, the AI can react to that in a much more realistic way. Physiological changes, as well as emotion changes, pretty much anything we can dream of at this point, it can be responsive to. And modular content. So we can really look at what are we building, how does it fit together, and how can it inform each other as we use AI to help us do that. So sim characters now can handle thousands of voice inputs without needing line-by-line scripting. And as someone who has helped build simulations where you're constantly looking at how does the simulation recognize what the learner says and what possible choices would we want for the patient to respond to, it was a little crazy trying to figure out all the different ways that someone could ask a question or respond to it. Something really exciting is looking at how performance data is generated automatically. So being able to track even more things about what the learner is doing, not just the clinical care that they're giving, but I think most excitingly is how they are communicating with the patient. And then faster scenario iteration. Here at OMS, we use AI to help us build simulations and to be able to do that at a much quicker speed than we were able to do in the past. So real case examples, a sepsis scenario. The learner is able to speak to the patient and the physician, which provides more dynamic interaction, higher immersion. AI powers the branching based on the escalation. So really dependent on how quickly does the learner recognize that the patient has a potential for sepsis? How quickly are they able to look for their resources or the protocols to treat sepsis? And then once they do that, how quickly are they actually employing those protocols? So things like antibiotics or sending for labs, so forth. And then at the end, there's an automatic performance summary after the scenario, which is not only useful to the learner who likes to have immediate feedback, but also for the educator to be able to, number one, look at individual performance, as well as looking at trends across a cohort. So one of the things that I have noticed, I often in my role attend conferences where I'm able to talk to not only our existing customers, but potential customers. And increasingly people are asking, do you use AI? And of course I answer, yes, we do use AI. But then when I ask them, okay, so why does that matter to you? What specifically are you looking for, and how we are using AI? There's no follow-up question. People just don't know what to ask next. They know they're supposed to ask about it, but they don't really know the implications. So looking at what are the questions that you should be asking as you're vetting vendors in simulation who do use AI. So asking, what does the AI actually do? Is it just running in the background? Is it being used with a large language model where it's responding to learners? Is it rule-based or machine learning? So in other words, how is that AI being directed when it's being used? Have safeguards been put in, especially around large language models? When we're looking at, how do we keep the learner on track? How do we make sure the learner doesn't veer off into, sort of dangerous pathways or pathways that aren't productive? What are the safeguards built into that? How robust is the natural learning processor? So is it just very surface, or are they using AI in very extensive ways? How is clinical accuracy ensured? So if they're using AI to help them build their clinical scenarios, is there actually a person or a subject matter expert who is going in and checking to be sure that the clinical content is correct and up to date? I think this is probably one of the most important questions to ask is, what data is being collected and where does it go? Educators, especially in academia, we are beholden to FERPA, and that's where we're looking at protecting their educational data, just like we would in HIPAA in healthcare. And so asking who's collecting that data, what is it being used for, and where is it going? And then can we test it before full deployment? So really being able to test a product, to be able to take it to your IT department and have them vet it as well, And many organizations now actually have an AI committee that looks at different ways that your organization is using AI and what safeguards and policies are there around that use. So make sure you're asking those questions. And if they don't have an answer, then to me, that's a red flag. So if they say things like, it just works out of the box, or we use ChatGPT, but then can't describe the guardrails that they use for GPT. Our AI learns from your users. Well, that tells you that it's collecting data about your learners. And you want to know, how is that data being used? And also, how is it being protected? So those are some red flags to look for. So implementation reality. What's working? AI should enhance, not replace good design. It's great for realism and scale, but needs review, especially when learners are making clinical judgments. We all know how complex that can be. I hear from both academia as well as healthcare that our graduates are still struggling with clinical judgments. So being really sure about vetting a product or a simulation to make sure that those clinical judgments are actually appropriate for, number one, the level of the learner, but also for the clinical situation. AI can't replace good simulation design. When we look at the best practices for simulation, within those practices, they talk a lot about what is the design of a good simulation. And AI should always be employing those same things, and we should be checking. It needs smart inputs. So this doesn't actually replace people. We still need subject matter experts as well as simulation education specialists to be able to make sure that we are producing quality simulation. But I think the most important thing to think about is that it can reduce repetition and manual labor, especially when we're looking at branching and audio and feedback. So we also think about things like what needs oversight in AI. So AI that's too generic. So if we're not prompting the AI in a very specific way, then it's possible for things to sort of go off the rails. So think about, you're giving AI instructions just like you would a novice. The more information, the better, to make sure that the AI does exactly what you'd like it to do. We've already talked about this, the lack of subject matter expert validation. Can never have too much of that. And then an over-reliance on automation. For those of us who've been doing this for a really long time, and we pulled mannequins out of boxes and we thought, oh, this is going to be great. We can go ahead and we can program the mannequin to do exactly what we wanted it to. And 9 times out of 10, it worked perfectly. But then there was that one student, that one learner who sort of went off the path, and we were relying too heavily on the automation, and then the simulation didn't make sense. I think one of the most important things when we think about using AI in simulation, and in fact in many parts of simulation, is the collaboration between the sim tech or the operation manager and the educator teams. AI enhanced sims require teamwork. The best results are going to come when techs and educators co-design and co-test with built-in feedback cycles. So just like we pilot any other simulation, we should be doing that with our simulations that we build with AI. Don't work in silos. So one person designs and the other person implements. Make sure you're working together. The best AI enhanced sims happen when techs, educators, and subject matter experts co-design. I've even seen groups all sit in the same room at the same time, which in these days sometimes seems kind of crazy because we're all just Zooming or doing Teams and that kind of thing. But sometimes sitting in the same room and really mapping out what we'd like the AI simulations to do still is the best choice. Make sure everyone reviews how the AI behaves before the learners use it. And so this can be time intensive, I know, but especially educators, before you're assigning any simulation that's based upon AI, go in and play the simulation in a couple of different ways. Play it in the way that you hope the learner goes through the simulation, so the correct actions, and then also go in and try to play it like you don't know what you're doing, because that's where you're going to see if there are any gaps and holes. We often design on the best case scenario, and we don't think about the worst case scenario. So AI in debriefing and reporting. I think probably this is the area that I'm most excited about because it's very labor intensive for educators, especially when we're looking at how are we evaluating our learners. Everything that we do with our learners these days, time is so precious and there's so much content that it needs to count. So how are we, when we're looking at competency-based education, how are we tracking that? So let's talk about AI debriefing is starting to support debriefing too. One of the things that I've gotten some feedback about, not so much in academia, but certainly in healthcare, where the cognitive overload of our practitioners is just, it's off the scale. And although they're using simulation, both VR and high fidelity simulation, when I ask what they're doing for debriefing, many times it's just not possible. And that's due to, lack of educator staff, it's due to timing, and it's due to the immense scale that education needs to be delivered. So when we start looking at, are there ways that AI can provide a safe and effective feedback to a learner immediately after they have participated in a simulation, is really important. I heard someone say to me at one point, everyone deserves a debrief. And I think that's a really powerful statement. So looking forward to what are we going to see around AI debriefing. I think the other really interesting thing about AI debriefing is it can debrief over and over again. Anyone who is on this webinar who has done simulation for 8 to 10 hours in a day and has to constantly debrief learners knows that you're not as good at 3 o'clock in the afternoon as you were at 8 o'clock in the morning. And the AI debriefer is going to provide consistent data and prompts to work from. They're not going to veer from, from the path based upon how they're feeling or some sort of emotional reaction that they may have to what the learner does. It's going to track competencies or key learning objectives. We all know that we have to keep track of these things. And if we build them into AI, they're going to be able to pull them out for us. We're not going to have to look at them. We'll be able to look at things like key decisions and timings. We can even look at, did they miss things or did they delay things? And AI will help us keep track of all of that. AI actually can suggest reflection and debriefing questions. I'm an experienced debriefer, but even when I use AI, it often comes back and prompts me, maybe not necessarily with the basic debriefing questions, but it often comes back with some really interesting follow-up questions that I might have. Or if I load data in from a particular cohort about how they performed, there may be areas that AI can identify that I should be including in all of my debriefing because that particular cohort may be struggling with a concept. And as I've said, it analyzes trends across learners and cohorts. Nothing is more powerful than when we have a learner who's struggling, but we can't seem to identify why. And being able to get and analyze their feedback over time from simulations may help us identify where's that key disconnect. And of course, we want everyone to be successful. So being able to get them back on track not only is great for our patients, but also quite profound for our learners. So what's next in AI simulation? What kind of things should we be looking at? So emotion recognition. We can pick up key phrases, we can pick up words, but tone or how we time what we're saying can be really important, we all know, when communicating. Communication scenarios is one of the biggest things that I hear from both healthcare and academia, in that our learners need practice with communication. Certainly in this digital age, we're used to texting or leaving messages, and that actual face-to-face contact can be really challenging, especially for people who don't have a lot of experience working with patients. So being able to hear, when you think about therapeutic communication or de-escalation or motivational interviewing, being able to recognize emotion, not only in how we speak, but maybe even in debriefing, so that we can identify if a learner has had issues. Generative scenario writing, so being able to take an existing scenario, feeding it into AI, and giving it new objectives, or giving it expanded objectives, and being able to have AI generate those new scenarios for us, so that we can have a nice look at how we might start with a novice learner and have that same concept in a series of simulations all the way through our expert level learners. Using learner analytics and to be able to predict what skills or what areas a learner might need help with going forward. We do this a little bit with some of our standardized testing programs. They're able sort of to predict where a learner might have a hard time, especially, or might be challenged, especially when we look at the NCLEX, right? We do those predictive testing to be able to see. But we could use simulation to be able to predict, where are the holes, where are the challenges that we might encounter in practice as well. And then, of course, our avatars or our characters with multilingual voice cloning. So being able to take any scenario and be able to adapt it to any language, which certainly in many parts of the world and the country would be very important, because not all learners, English is not their first language. So looking at how do we make that seamless, and how do we make the dialect be reflective of where exactly we are practicing. So top 5 AI integration tips, I think. We want AI integration to go smoothly, and we want it to support learning, not just automation. So this is kind of a quick reference. Start small. Use AI where it saves time immediately. One exercise that I found to be particularly helpful when I started using AI was I made a list of the things in my job that I do that are very repetitive and I don't necessarily enjoy. And then looking to see, are there ways that AI could help me make that better? And so just starting to use it in my own work, not necessarily, across a department or an organization, but what could I do to change my day-to-day work? Validate AI responses with your clinical and educator teams. So making sure that when we put AI into practice, that we're validating it with a bunch of different people. Because as you know, you can be highly immersed in something and think you've covered all of your bases. And it's not until someone who doesn't live inside your head takes a look at it that they're able to sort of point out, where the gaps or holes are, or even additional potential that you may not have been able to recognize. Making scenarios modular and easy to update. So that's sort of where I went back earlier and discussed having, a base scenario. So maybe a base sepsis scenario that is, fed into your AI. And then by changing the learning objectives or changing the challenges or even the level of the learner, AI can produce a version of that particular scenario, that's really focused on your learner group's needs. Documenting feedback from users and learners is really important. So when people are using anything that has been generated by AI, a practice that I have is that if I've used AI to support what I'm doing, I make sure that people know that and that it's there, and that I'm asking for feedback about that particular experience, so that we can see, where the holes are. And of course, our learners are the end users. So things like, I think a perfect example is when we use a large language model and the learner has to speak to the patient, getting some feedback on, how natural did that feel? Were there any points in the conversation where the AI struggled or didn't understand what you were asking it, as well as any suggestions that they may have? And of course, I know that we all talk about this all the time, is that AI can't replace humans. It's here to enhance what you do, but and it may make what you do look a little different, but we absolutely need the humans to make sure that we are being true to ourselves. Earlier this year, I was in the UK and speaking to educators there, and the subject of AI came up, and I was really quite impressed with the way when they were talking about using AI in education, how they were sort of approaching it. And one person said, it's not dissimilar, and some of us can remember this, but probably not all of us, when the internet came along, right? Learners could jump on the internet. They didn't need to look at a book anymore. They would pull resources. They didn't go to the library when they were writing reports, and so forth. Teaching them that, number one, you had to vet that information you were getting from the internet, as well as that you needed to be able to cite the source that you got the information, just like you would if you were using a book or a journal. And they very much were approaching the use of AI in education in the same way. So not only is it important to identify where we can use it most effectively, but also teaching our learners about how using AI and what's responsible going forward, I think is going to be a key factor in making sure that we're using AI in the future to our best advantage and not our detriment. So a couple of different things. One of the things I'd like to ask is if you all are using AI in your current practice, maybe popping in the chat one thing that you find most helpful that you're using AI for, or if you're not using AI as a result of listening to this presentation, are there anything that immediately comes to mind that you think you will research about using AI in your practice? And at this point, I am happy to answer any questions. So I'm checking my messages here to see if I can see any questions. Let's have a look here. All right. Someone asked if the session will be recorded, and yep, the recording will be sent to you, as well as others who were able to sign up for the webinar but not able to attend. I see that marketing answered that. A question from Anita. Anita says, do you have any suggestions related to policies, guidelines, etc., when using AI integration as it relates to the user and the end user who are being exposed to the scenarios? Well, I would say, Anita, first of all, I would check with your organization and see if IT or anyone else has an AI committee, and many places do. If you are in academia, I would check with your registrar's office. They often are the ones who have most up-to-date policies on how we protect data. I think it's always fair to let people know when we're using AI for different things, so that they know that they're being exposed to that. But that's where I would go to first. You also may need to check with your legal department and ask them, do they have any policies currently on the use of AI, or any contracts that you might be signing with companies who do use AI. And then Misty's asking about a completion certificate, and I believe Kat has that information at the end of the webinar. Any other questions? Well, thank you, everyone. I would encourage anybody who has any more questions, or would like to have a follow-up of any kind, please reach out to your educational specialist or your account manager, or you can reach out to me directly. Or if you visit oxfordmedicalsimulation.com, you certainly can contact us through there, and I would be happy to connect with anybody who would like any follow-up. So thank you, everyone.